Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of our Innovation in Education Conference. Yesterday, we had a great discussion focusing on early childhood education. Today, we are focusing on K through 12, particularly the role of choice and accountability in improving student outcomes. And we have wonderful speakers from around the country here today. One of my messages that I've learned, and I think is really true, is we have a 50-state laboratory that we can learn from and figure out what's working around, and states and cities are trying things. Some things are working, some aren't. Let's learn from the best, and let's get that message out there so we can learn from one another. And so thank you to all of our speakers who've traveled to be with us here today. And to start this morning, we're starting here at home, and I'm really pleased that Dr. Brenda Cassellius has agreed to join us for this first hour. Since 2010, Brenda has been the state of Minnesota's Commissioner on Education. Earlier in her career, Dr. Cassellius was an expertise, a broad range of instructional and leadership roles in education, everything from being a classroom teacher to a school administrator to the superintendent of school systems, both in Tennessee and Minnesota. So truly a lifetime of experience in the education sector. Brenda has kindly offered a full hour to spend with us. She's going to start off by giving a brief introduction on some recent work that they're doing at the department, and then she and I are going to have a discussion about some of the issues in education facing Minnesota. But then we really look forward to hearing from all of you and making this an active and informed discussion. And just a reminder, we're live streaming this, so hopefully we have millions of people around the world who are tuned in right now. But just when we go to Q&A, please make sure to use the microphone so that folks on the live stream can hear from you. So first of all, please join me in welcoming Brenda to us. So Brenda, why don't I turn it over to you?
Great. Well, thank you, Neel, for inviting me to this convening today, and thanks for your leadership also in this space. And thanks to everyone out here. When I first came this morning, I was saying hi to so many faces here that I know who have been engaged in much of this work, either as a researcher or as a practitioner or as a community member. So thank you for continuing to advocate for different ways that we can do this work together so that kids get what they need to be successful in life. So many thanks. I did prepare a bunch of keynote presentation, and then I saw so many of you, and I said, well, I'm not going to do that because I think what's more valuable for folks like you would be to be able to spend a lot of time asking us questions and probing and really thinking deeper about the issues. That's what I think would be most meaningful for your time here today. So I'll just give a few comments, and then we'll just take the rest of the time as like kind of a fireside chat, if that's okay.
Sounds perfect.
Okay. So, I've been at this now 8 years. And boy, I don't know where the time flies. And it feels sometimes like you're just getting so much done. And then sometimes it feels like you're kind of stuck. So having a convening like this around innovation is really another great way to take another big step forward as we think about a transition and the opportunities that we have to build on some of the things that we've been able to accomplish over the past 8 years under the Dayton administration, as well as looking forward to the next administration and what exactly can we do together to really launch schools and think differently about how we attack the really entrenched disparities that we have in Minnesota. And I hope that we can look at a lens that's broader than just education. Educators and schools have been trying to do this work alone for nearly 30 years now. And I think that with the new North Star system that I think we're going to focus on today and some of the innovation pieces around that, we really have an opportunity as a state to embrace a new model moving forward and really be just a little bit bolder. I was just telling Ted Coldery, who is always challenging us and asking us to do things just a little bit more out of the box, that every year I have a superintendent's conference. And all the superintendents come down and we talk about change or we talk about innovation. Matter of fact, they've had that on their platform for several years. However, they're just a little bit stuck and they don't want to move through that. They feel like, okay, the state has said no, or the teachers union won't let us do it, or the resources aren't there to do it, or I don't have the time to do it, or I don't have the facilities to do the innovation, or it's not the right time, or I don't have the right higher ed partners. And these excuses keep getting made up. And I keep challenging them to say, as local school boards and as superintendents, you have a lot of authority. I, as commissioner, have very little authority within what actually happens within a school district or within a school. So it's really up to school principals, school superintendents, and school boards and charter directors to be able to say, what can I do within the bounds of state testing requirements, for instance, or having to teach the standards, for instance, or teacher licensure, which are really the three key pieces that educators and practitioners will tell us are holding them back. What can I do within that and really begin to think differently about the work? So a few years ago, we passed a law called the Innovation Law. It allows the commissioner to give some waiver to school districts. It doesn't let us waive out of federal accountability. It doesn't allow us to waive out of state accountability, but it does allow them to kind of give a new mindset, I think, and a new shift to a school board and some protections around innovating different. We had several school districts step up to that. The ones that come to mind that have really been most innovative are Bloomington, Farmington, and Spring Lake Park, and then Kingsland in rural Minnesota. And so they've been doing things more around career pathway work, looking at high school redesign, and looking at the student day. We have several other pockets throughout Minnesota of high schools that are looking at redesigning some of the way that they are doing offerings for students. And that seems to also be an area where there's some innovation happening. Of course, there's some innovation happening within our charter sector. We were able to secure the charter replication grant since 2015. We've received 2 of those. So a lot of funding has been gone into those. We've had about 18 charter replication grants that we've been able to do for high quality charters. And that also has been able to have some expansion or some additional charters enter the space, which is also a way to innovate. But it's still around the edges. It's still not pulling the Band-Aid off, so to speak, and really rethinking how we do our work. And so I think with school districts over the past 8 years, having been able to kind of get their footing with the funding pieces, because we had been borrowing for so many years. You know, when we first came into office, there was a $6 billion deficit. So for the first 2 years of the administration, really we were trying to backfill just to get on a good playing field where we could start eliminating the excuses of resources. And then we had a strong early childhood focus. So we were doing a lot of innovation around the early childhood side, which I know you spent yesterday on, and Wayne Nguyen, who is a superstar in our office, was here speaking on the panel. And so we did scholarships. We were attempting to do more universal pre-K. We also provided additional support for Head Start, ECFE, which is Early Childhood Family Education. So we had this mixed delivery system of trying to target resources to at-risk kids, and the governor believed in all of these, and also provide universal, because that's really the ideal, to get to every single child having 2 years. So a lot of innovation. And then we worked with Art Rolnick and his group around the parent quality system that they had designed with the business community. And so we were able to get a Race to the Top grant, expand out our parent aware system, work on teacher workforce for early childhood providers with our Department of Human Service providers, doing much of that work with us around parent aware and the workforce, which is critical. And then trying to work with our children's cabinet and some of our transformation zones and promised neighborhoods around innovation with kind of rallying the community and looking at wraparound kind of community school within the preschool space there. So we've done innovation around that. Of course, the governor pushed for all-day kindergarten so that students weren't coming behind, and that then when they got there, they had a full year, all-day, everyday kindergarten. Now we have 99% of our students accessing all-day kindergarten, which is good. And then, of course, the thing that you'd asked me to speak about today was really our accountability and support systems. So those have gone through from No Child Left Behind, where everybody said it just didn't work and everybody kind of hated it, to then having the opportunity to be one of first of 10 states doing the waiver That was a big step forward to focus on growth and to build out what was kind of a system of doing accountability where our cooperatives around the state, our regional centers, would work with school districts on planning, but then there was no implementation or support. So those big plans would go into nice big binders, and they would end up on shelves, and they really wouldn't become alive. So we shifted that and turned that with the waiver, and we're able to build out really a wonderful system of coaching and support and on-site embedded professional development for our teachers right there in the classroom and on-site, and doing that all through Minnesota. And why was that important? Because it's important that you monitor implementation and hold the adults accountable for what they say they're going to get done for kids. That's one. Two, we found that their standards were not being implemented because of so many years of cuts. They had cut all of the support systems at the district level because they wanted to keep the cuts away from the classroom. So we had a number of school districts, especially in rural Minnesota, who didn't have curriculum specialists, who didn't have reading teachers or reading specialists or math specialists or specialists who could help you with special education, or in our new growing demographic through all of Minnesota, our students who are still yet to master English. So as we see a rapid shift in our demographics, we need a rapid shift in the adults and their preparation in being able to work with diverse communities that were economically distressed, and poor families who maybe were experiencing homelessness or instability of being highly mobile. So, and then of course, with now one of the huge big pieces we see school districts really talking about is the severe nature of the mental health crisis that we have going on among youth and among the stress within families. So we see a lot of social emotional learning focus happening in schools, trying to build good school culture and then have strong school leadership, and then having highly prepared and masterful teachers. That's really the secret success, I think. I've often get asked, well, if you could change one thing, or you could, ensure that schools are going to turn around, what would it be? And I say, I visited 44 4- and 5-time reward schools under our waiver system. Every year would be a reward school. So I went out to 44 of those schools, and I asked the teachers, what's the number one reason you think you're getting sustained results? And they would say, because we feel like a family. We take care of relationships. Well, how do you scale that statewide with the adults? How do you get folks really wanting to do that core work? And it's hard work, and I say it's the heart work, really. And I think some of the social emotional learning pieces will give them the tools and the training to be able to do that in a more concrete way together as the adults in the building. And so, and then after the waiver, with building out the strong regional centers of excellence, we actually received a Humphrey Award for that, and we received a award from Harvard for those centers, and we're really proud of the work that we did. We took the best from No Child Left Behind, which was focusing on equity and disparities and making sure that those kids that need it the most were going to get the resources. Then on the waiver, what we took was the building out of the support system and how strong that was, and our teacher evaluation work that we did. And then now with North Star, all of you should have a copy of this. I'm sorry that the people at home don't have it. But there's many resources on our website. And this is just a little one-page summary from you. We had over 300 meetings across the state, some in just really small community meetings, focused, good, diverse participation from all kinds of folks across Minnesota, thousands of people giving input, many legislative hearings on the new system. And so what we were able to do was focus on 3 core things. One was student outcomes and academic achievement, of course, and that's mostly still focused on test scores. And then secondarily, focusing on English language proficiency, which we hadn't ever had as part of our accountability system. And with a growing demographic, it's so important to make sure that we're focusing on students' progress for acquiring the language and their success. And then also graduation rates, which we had done already within the waiver, and then consistent attendance. We'd like to have done more around well-rounded, looking at programming, AP programming, opportunities to really think boldly and innovation, that kind of thing. But we weren't able to have our data systems quite mature yet to be able to collect that statewide. And so we continue to work on that. And then a key other piece of the North Star system is really the accountability through reporting. Just publicly being transparent about how schools are doing and about the support that they're getting. And so we have a new reporting system that we launched. There'll be new pieces added as we go and as we're able to collect more data. The one piece that I'm most excited about will be next year adding the financial transparency pieces, which as Federal Reserve, I'm sure you're very interested in the money, because I think that where the money goes is where your heart goes and where your priorities are. So that will give parents easy, plain language pieces of information about how much money is coming both at the state and federal level, how much is allocated out to each school building from a district. So we'll know about equitable distribution of those the funding streams, and we'll know then how those are being spent, tied then to their World's Best Workforce strategic planning. And so I'm really excited about the foundation we've been able to build. I'm excited about the direction Minnesota is taking, and it's going to take all of us to really push it just a little bit further.
That's great. Thank you for that. You covered a lot of ground. You've sparked a lot of questions in my head. So I just want to start with a few things. First, I want to think about you've been at this a long time, as you talked about. You've had an extraordinary career in education and education reform. But if we step back and look at the raw data nationally, and it's true in Minnesota too, but if you look nationally at the achievement gap that we're also focused on, if we're honest with ourselves, we've basically made no progress in closing the gap.
Yeah.
And when you look at that, what do you take away from that? Have we just, as you said, maybe we haven't been bold enough, or maybe the achievement gap would be even worse if we weren't doing the things that we're doing. What do we do? We can't keep doing what we've been doing. What should we do now?
Well, it's one of the things that I really wish we had been able to move. In 2013, we saw our NAEP scores kind of go and our gap closing happened. And I'm not sure why we saw it, if it was a difference in sampling or what happened. I tried to look at that and try to understand it. I think that there's a gap between what is expected in our standards and what's actually being taught. 20% of our teachers tell us that they're actually fully implementing our standards. And so when we look solely at test scores, really I think what we're seeing is a gap of what's being tested and what's being taught. And there's a lack of understanding among our educators about the sophistication of the assessment now. I'm not trying to make excuses. I do believe that there are gaps, there are real gaps. And our students of color and our students who are EL and our special ed students and our American Indian students are behind their white peers, no doubt, no matter on what measurement. Sure. But I do think that there's also the new tests are very challenging for teachers to understand and unpack, and we need to get them more help. We hired a specialist in the department to go out to school districts and actually talk to teachers about test design, test construction, and about the standards and the alignment and the depth of understanding students have to be able to show proficiency on those exams. And so I think that that's part of it. I think we have a number of our teachers who are using a different assessment, the NWAs, and I think that the NWA or MAP tests that teachers call them are different structured tests, and I think that poses some confusion because they spend so much time on that they don't spend on the comprehensive exams that students are given, so that looks different. And then the NAEP tests, of course, the national test that's given to a small sampling of our students each year, about 3,000 students at each grade level for each discipline. That also is not aligned to our Minnesota standards. So you could get fifth grade items that are given, fourth grade items that are given on the NAEP test, but we may not teach that until fifth grade, for instance. So students may not have it. But I think outside of that, I think part of the intractability of the actual disparities is that we also see disparities in housing. We see disparities in joblessness. We see disparities in wages. We see disparities in family leave. We see disparities in transportation or in how, all of these other social pieces in Minnesota, unfortunately. As the data goes, so do families. And so then does the education. And I think we need to really tackle it all hands on deck.
So one thing, when I mentioned this yesterday at the start of the conference, when I came to Minnesota, Minnesota has we have a lot going for us. This is our economy is very diverse. Most major sectors of the U.S. economy are here. That diversity is a source of strength. On average, our schools are very high quality. On average, our students do well relative to their peers around the country. But those averages then mask the gaps that we've just been talking about. So one of the things and Minnesota also is very innovative, right? The birthplace of charter schools, open enrollment. I mean, these are pretty interesting, potentially very powerful concepts. So you and I have talked about this, and I wrote an op-ed about this. One thing that surprised me is that charters in Minnesota, on average, don't do particularly well. They don't outperform the traditional public schools. And so I started to try to understand why that is. And I visited some very high-performing charter schools. There are some that are doing great with low-income kids and kids of color. And I asked them, and I said, well, what's your waiting list? Because famously in New York, some of the really high-performing charter schools have waiting lists 5 to 6 times oversubscribed, and then they have to have a lottery. And the principal said, oh, we don't have a waiting list. And I said, wait, how can that be? There are these huge gaps, and you don't have a waiting list. And my conclusion from that was that a lot of parents in Minnesota are confused about which schools are good and which schools are not. And as we dug into it with our staff here, it seems like we're Minnesota nice when it comes to our failing schools. That if we have lousy charters, we need to be brutal in assessing them and shutting down bad charters and making sure the money and the kids are going to the high quality charters because they're the ones that are performing. And you talked about expanding the successful schools. Maybe you could talk about, do we have the stomach to really be tough on those that are failing?
Yeah, well, we do. So when I first came into office, we had 2 charters that were in litigation with the department, and one of them closed and the other one had to do some significant reforms. Since 2011, 37 charters have closed. I don't think most people know that. And then 5 charters that didn't serve students also closed. Of our replication, we gave out 18 replication, but then only 15 are actually replicating. Because of the difficulties, it's just very challenging to start a new school. Right. And then to sustain it for a long time and then to get your roots in. Because the traditional public school system is so entrenched in Minnesota, most families want to send their kid, they move into the neighborhood, they want to send their kids to the neighborhood school. And if it's a good quality school and it feels good, then they'll send their kids there, regardless of what test scores say. And so I think that as I've traveled Minnesota, I have not been in any schools that don't seem like they're good environments for children, right? I've talked to the teachers, I've talked to the principals, and they all are really, we have beautiful facilities across the state, handful of schools that are kind of much older. But even so, our custodians and engineers take such a good job with our facilities. It's not like when I was in Memphis and the facilities were just horrible. And the poverty was I was just shocked at what I saw in the school system and what the environments children were going to school in. I can only imagine how they are in other places. But when you look at the level of teaching and learning, and you go to those reward schools, for instance, traditional reward schools, or you go to a Friendship Academy, or you go to a Trek North, or you go to a Da Vinci Academy or an Avalon, these schools actually have master teachers who are just getting it done for kids. Mm-hmm. There's nothing special really about these schools. And I think that earlier, 20 years ago, we said, let's do these charters and have them innovate. But really, when you go visit charters, they look a lot like traditional public schools. Many times they still, switch on the hour, the teacher, they still are having teacher-led classes, and there's not much happening that looks any different.
But I think,
than
but you said it in your earlier remarks, and it really resonated with me. Every school that I have visited, and I've not visited nearly as many as you have, but that's really getting it done. You said it. I mean, it's a great culture in that school.
Yes.
It's led by
and
a
you
great.
can feel it.
You can feel it.
Yeah, right.
It's led by a great principal
Yeah.
who recruits teachers who share that vision. They support one another.
Yeah.
Now, I agree with you. It's hard to scale that.
Yeah.
But we just need to find a mechanism by which we can let 1,000 of those bloom?
Yeah, I mean, you need to cultivate teams, and those teams need to have a great leader, and you need to do the care and feeding of the adults. And so I think that a lot of times principals think their job is to be there for the kids. Their job is really to be there, do care and feeding for the adults, the teachers, so that then the teachers can teach the kids. They have to make sure they have manageable class sizes. Some teachers can handle 35, 40 kids. Some teachers can't. You have to know your teachers and be able to work within their strengths and work within that team environment that you have going on. And once a principal gets a good team, they're on fire and they go. I think that what happens with schools that are having trouble is that they have school leaders who don't understand that, or they have teachers who aren't working together on behalf of children. Or you have a mismatch, again, of just not masterful teachers around the content and around the instructional pedagogy that's needed to meet a new diverse classroom of students.
One interesting factoid that I learned recently was that approximately 50% of African American families in Minneapolis, I'll see if I get the statistic right, send their child to a non-traditional public school. Maybe it's a charter school or they open enroll, but they're choosing not to just send their kid to the nearest neighborhood school. So I find that a really hopeful statistic because, a lot of times the criticism is, well, parents aren't that engaged. And it's the parents who are engaged who can avail themselves of these other options. But if half the families are making that choice, that says to me the parents are engaged and they do want a better opportunity for their kids. I'm just curious, what advice do you give to families? Somebody has a young...
In my 30 years of being an educator, nearly 30, I have never met a parent that doesn't want a great education for their kid, that doesn't love their child, that doesn't want them to be successful. They want to. Oftentimes they're too busy. I mean, they have like a really full life, or they may have other issues going on with
multiple jobs,
or mental health issues themselves, or financial stresses, or transportation problems. Minnesota could do a really big thing with open enrollment. They could actually pay for the transportation for kids to get there. So what we do on one hand is say, yeah, you can open enroll. Poor family, anybody can go to any school they want to go to if you can get your kid there. So how is that equitable? So that's a huge, I think, piece that we could fix in terms of the policy.
And what about, I'm glad you said that. What about the artificial caps? Will we let districts say, well, we're going to set the cap of how many external kids we're going to take, right? Should we eliminate those caps?
Well, those caps are there really only because of facilities. So we do regulate that at the department. You can't just say you can't. We're not going to take you, and we also have blind acceptance, so you're not supposed to put race or special ed or anything like that on those open enrollment forms when people apply. But there's a lot of research that shows, just the name
is an indicator.
Can give it some sort of bias on those applications. So I think that there's work to do in open enrollment. I wish the Office of Legislative Auditor would look at open enrollment and make recommendations to the legislature on that. I've asked many times for them to do so because I think that there's lessons we could learn from that to be able to look at choice a little bit closer.
So let's open it up to the audience. I've got lots more questions I'm going to come back to you with, but let's just see what folks in the audience have on their minds.
Hi. This is really interesting. So I have a...
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Just tell us your name, please.
So Steve Rifkin, I'm an economist at UIC. And I guess I had really two questions. One is, there seems to be a tension between universal and concentration on the most needy. And so given the shortage of early year educators, that to have a universal program, it may make it more difficult to have the kind of highly enriching program, particularly in terms of how resources are allocated, to really kind of eliminate the achievement gap over the long run. And the second question was really about, well, let's leave it at that. I'm sure other people have a lot of questions. So just that tension between universal and a concentration on the most needy.
So the governor has had a ton of respect for the business community when he first came in. I think it was one of my first meetings I had was with Todd Otis and Art Rolnick and with the governor, and they were talking about the project that they had done through the MELF for scholarships, and we were able to get $4 million for targeted scholarships because we had $6 billion deficit, but we wanted to start on early childhood, and so he fought hard in the late hours to make sure that that bill didn't get killed to start our path down that. So he's supported both targeted and universal. I believe personally the goal is universal for everybody, and everybody talks about scarce resources. I just don't believe this. I don't think that that's true, that there are scarce resources. I know Wei was on the panel yesterday and said it's about priorities, and it's absolutely about priorities. Minnesotans could do a lot more to fund their schools. We're about 22nd right now in the nation on how we fund our schools, and but we're number one for how we fund them equitably. So Ed Trust just did a great article, 2 years I think in a row they did on state funding, and what they found was that Minnesota actually was number two, I think, number 2 and number 3 for how we fund our high poverty and high minority schools. And the way that we distribute our funding goes to high poverty and high minority schools. Great to not be on the bottom of the list for something around equity, which is good. However, we overall fund them 22nd in the nation, so we could do more there. As for universal pre-K, it would cost us, I don't know, somewhere around $1 billion, I think, is the estimate to be able to do more pre-K for every single student, 3 and 4-year-old in the state. I think it's a matter of will. Minnesotans used to have more of their personal income going toward education when we were kids. And I don't understand why we would give our kids less, 1% less than what our parents did for us in Minnesota. That 1% equates to $1 billion. And so I think we could do just a little bit more for our kids. Of course, you know, I'm a good Democrat and liberal or whatever people want to call me, but I think we're shortchanging our kids. And I think we could do universal. I think it's important. I think there's been projects in Oklahoma, there's been projects in Georgia and Tennessee and Boston and all over, and Chicago, of course, that really demonstrate that universal is beneficial for all kids. And so it's about, and it's about the quality of it. There's additional resources that are available for families, like the transportation barriers that are out there. If you give a scholarship, like the EL support services or the special ed services that students can get, or the meals that students get when they come to school, or the social services or mental health supports, or all of those things that really matter. So I'm a big universal believer, but if that can't get done, then you do as much universal as you can in those schools that are really high poverty and high minority, and then you do the targeted where you have to do targeted.
Hi, my name is Ben Austin. I run a nonprofit called Kids Coalition in Los Angeles. I'm a privileged public school parent. I send my daughters to our local neighborhood school in the LAUSD school district, and our school looks and feels sort of like what you were talking about. You walk in and it feels like it's a high quality school. My question for you though is that my daughter's feels to me like my daughter's school looks and operates and educates in pretty much the same way as my school did as a kid. And that it's preparing them, maybe doing a really good job of preparing them to graduate into a world that doesn't really exist anymore. Yeah. And so, in the context of the conversation you're having right now, I'm curious about if you were to kind of hit the reset button and really reimagine public education in Minnesota, both at a school level and a systems level, for the kids of today, not the kids of yesterday. What would it look like, and how would it be different?
Oh, I wish I had a magical fairy wand. The commissioner fairy wand. If I were able to reset it without any bounds, I think I wouldn't start with elementary, because part of elementary is just kind of corralling all the little bodies around, right? So I think it's harder to innovate around elementary school at this point. But I do think there's great innovation that could happen at middle and high school. I would probably do a case managed model at middle school. I'd have support teams of counselors, social workers, nurse, and teacher teams that would work together around a case managed model with 6th graders. They would follow them from 6th grade all the way through high school. And I don't necessarily think that we need 11th and 12th grade any longer. I think that students are much more mature and sophisticated and precocious, quite honestly, about their own learning. And so I think that, if they want to know something, they know how to question and ask. I think it's mostly about asking and teaching kids to be discerning now about what's fake and what's real, what's good information and bad information, and then having them apply it. So I'd probably do a project-based type of integrated units that would be well planned out. I'd give teachers time within to do that. I would run more like a college type of schedule with middle and high school, rather than every day, having reading at 8 a.m. and then PE and that. They would have physical fitness every single day as part of their day, whether it's yoga or a really high intensity workout, or whether it's being part of a hockey team or whatever. They would have time built out for that. And they could also do activities and clubs and theater and art and music and choir, and explore that way, because I think that when you have a developed mind, you also have an artistic and creative mind that needs to be developed alongside that academic side of the mind. And so that's what the school would look like. So they might have a class that's a seminar on citizenship, for instance, on a Saturday, and it may be that you're going to down to the legislature and you're going to do a hearing, or you're going to do whatever. But the key pieces would be strong academics embedded within a project-based learning type of experiential learning from 6th through high school. And then if they're ready to launch in 11th grade, they would launch then into post-secondary, or they would launch into a gap year and do a service project overseas that we would arrange in a field study, or they may launch into doing more of a local kind of entrepreneurship business model if they wanted to do that. Or they could, if this is a child that needed more support, you could still do a mainstream type of, structured program for them as well if they needed that. But it would be very individualized, personalized, and it would be much smaller units. I think it's really important at the middle school level to have much smaller units than what we have now. There should not be any middle schools with 30 kids in a class. We are completely missing the boat on middle school education. We're dealing with early childhood and high school, and forgetting about the core adolescence where children really decide whether they're going to engage fully in their education or not.
Are there any schools that are pioneering this model that we could look to?
For
The model you just described about the case managed.
No, I don't know any of them that are looking at eliminating 11th and 12th grade. But I'd like to challenge people to. I just think our kids they're smart. They may not have demonstrated that yet on our exams. They're thinking differently. They know how to use technology. They know how to find information. Way better. How many of you need to ask your kids every now and then to help you with something on the computer, or help you with a question? How many of you don't know a question and you're able to go to the internet and usually find it? We are completely still trying to work out of a textbook in our high schools, and teachers are still trying to be the sage on the stage dumping information to students when that's not how they learn any longer.
So where does, one thing that I hear a lot from people when I travel around our region is that, we need to bring something like the trades back into schools, whether it's vocational training. Allegedly, everyone says we've got shortages of plumbers and welders. I don't believe it, but people say we have shortages of these skills. I think wages need to go up. That's a separate discussion. And most people that I meet say, yes, we need to not send every kid to a four-year college, that these other skills are important too. But when I push them, they're never talking about their own kids.
That's right.
So I'm just curious.
And the data still shows that if you have a four-year college degree,
yeah, absolutely,
your wages are going to be so much more, or
absolutely.
a graduate degree. And so the question to ask when people say that to you is whose kids?
Yeah.
And who should be in those career tech programs?
But nonetheless,
I mean, not that it's not important.
Agreed,
right? I mean,
it is
for
important.
where it's the right fit.
but do you think we've gone too far towards making sure every kid is prepared for college, and we've lost something in opening people's eyes and minds that there are other options available?
Yes, I do think that we threw out the baby with the bathwater this was maybe 30 years ago, we started to just say no vocational ed, all college ready.
Right.
And I do think that there are welders and plumbers and carpenters and all of the trades and manufacturing and even some entry-level engineering jobs and things like that our two-year associates is good for. But I don't think that kids should get stuck in that. I mean, not that that's getting stuck. I don't want that to sound like that. I want them to do what they love to do, right? And you can earn a really good wage as a plumber. And so I think that there's definitely the need for that. But I also think that there's a need for four-year college degree still. But I think that needs to shift too. So I think not only are there reforms in K-12 or E-12, I think that higher ed needs to reform as well. And thinking, one of the challenges in thinking about the fairy wand, is I'm not certain why business hasn't stepped up to create their own college campuses on their business centers. I know that Google, Boeing, and Pixar have universities and they do their own professional development, but why aren't they doing like a military recruitment model where they go back to the high schools, identify kids in their local communities or across the nation, do competitions, have them come and start recruiting their
I can
kids.
think of one. I don't know if it still exists. So I started out as an engineer, and I knew when I was in high school that General Motors had something called GMI, General Motors Institute, where it was their own engineering school for the automotive sector. So that was one example. I don't know if they still do it. Let me look to the audience and see. Anusha?
Hi, I'm Anusha Nath here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So I had a question about, you mentioned the changing accountability system and the new flexibility waiver that came about from the No Child Left Behind. And you mentioned that there's increasing support that the state is providing to failing schools and so on. So my question to you is that under the No Child Left Behind, there were very strict sanctions that were given. For example, if there were consistently underperforming districts or schools, then those districts had to provide school choice and pay for transportation for students. And some of these sanctions were removed under the waiver, and under the current system, it seems that these sanctions don't exist, but it's mostly the support that's given to schools. So it seemed that the stick has been taken away. Also, I see that in the previous system, we had reward schools, and then we had focus and priority schools. So there was this sort of carrot, which was recognition through reward schools for schools which had previously not done well. And so some of that carrots also sort of diffuse. I just see that sort of now the schools are just support schools, different types of support schools. So, and just related to that point, you mentioned that 37 charter schools have closed since 2011, and as if I recollect correctly, most of them were because of financial irregularities and not because of poor performance. So I'm just wondering, the question to you is, if we've taken away the stick and the carrots are not very strong, why do you think the current system would do better than the previous system?
Yeah. So a couple things, let me clarify. So we do still recognize schools, and we put out our recognition lists a few weeks ago. So we are still doing, we just don't call them reward schools, but we recognize now almost like a badging for different things that schools are showing success in. So we do the recognition still. There are still sanctions. So schools not only have to do a report to the community and also have to do support side of things. If they don't improve within 3 years, there's still the there's still in the law that you can close or restart a school or offer choice or take away funding. So those are still in it, but it's one step removed. So if you're still in underperforming after this first round, then those harder sanctions kick in. So we still have the carrots and the stick. I'm not much of a believer in carrots and sticks. I think that it's the community and the stakeholders and the board and the superintendent and the adults who are creating the conditions for children to succeed. Didn't have to want to do it intrinsically and going to have to do the hard work to turn around a school. That carrots and sticks are short term. They don't really get the results you want to get long term. So, but they are still part of the law and they're still part of the system. Where Minnesota actually has a bigger stick is currently we have a law in the books called the World's Best Workforce Law. We wrote that law as a results kind of accountability piece so that we could get a whole state moving in the same direction and working together. We have 5 key goals within the World's Best Workforce Law, which is every child prepared for kindergarten, every child reading on grade level at 3rd grade, making sure kids are graduating on time, making sure they're career and college ready, and then closing achievement gaps. Every single district currently in the state of Minnesota in charter school writes a strategic plan around that. Their resources follow and they have to hold a public hearing. And they set goals. If they don't meet their goals, and we've aligned this now to ESSA, the new federal accountability. So we have both the federal and the state accountability coming together, but the stick or the teeth in the system altogether comes from state law because it allows the commissioner for the first time ever to withhold 2% of a district's funding in order to more aggressively meet their goals with commissioner approved and commissioner guided strategies. That's the first time we've ever had that kind of authority. So up to 2% of the funding, it'll stay in the district, but now the commissioner can say you have to spend it this way. The great thing about that is you're able then to redirect the resources to the kids that need it the most or where we see that there's a shortfall. Also within that, there was the Integration Revenue Program. It was also often criticized that there was no accountability around the Integration Revenue Program and that the Republicans sunsetted that in 2011. Well, when the Democrats regained control in 2013, there was a whole reform group that got together, a panel commission, restructured the Integration Revenue Program, and then added accountability to that. So now if you're not meeting your gap closures, then now the commissioner can withhold up to 20% of that funding, and that's a $200 million program. So that's specifically for gap closing. So this is our first round where we have told school districts, you must rewrite your Integration Revenue Program plans. You must rewrite your strategic plans. We're working with 37 districts and I think 17 charters, don't count me on that, for district accountability around World's Best Workforce. And I think it's almost every single outside of a handful of integration districts where we're saying you have to rewrite your plan and those have to be reapproved. So this is the first time there's been this level of accountability. In terms of the support side of the accountability, we had 155 schools that we were supporting under our regional centers and under our waiver. We are now supporting over 500 schools. And this is because we are supporting high schools in a way that we've never supported high schools before, because we lowered the cell size for the accountability for high schools. So, and it's now any high school with a grad rate lower than 67%, it has to get support, is now getting support. What's specific about Minnesota, and there's no other state in the nation that's done this, is we are not just doing 67% of the overall graduation rate in the school. Every single student group, that's how much equity matters to us. And our stakeholders said, let's hold schools accountable. So if your American Indian rate is 30%, you're going to be getting support, and you're on the list of getting support. I don't know of any other state, and I've asked, that's doing it. They're just using the overall graduation rate of less than 67. So it's a much higher bar we're setting and saying we need to move this faster. I do want to say in Minnesota, we have the highest graduation rates we've ever had. In every single student group, we've seen rapid gap closure, and the reason is, I believe, because of our waiver. Because at a time when we were only having about 50% of our high schools be in our accountability system, because they just didn't have 40 kids in their graduating class.
But aren't you worried that if the test score gap isn't closing, but the graduation gap is closing, that we're graduating people who shouldn't be graduating?
I would be if there was another indicator that wasn't going down, and that's in our college readiness. So we do a Getting Ready report, I think it's every couple of years through our SLED system. And what we know is, I think we used to have somewhere around, I want to say it was 25% when we came in of students who had to take Dev Ed. Now we're down to, I think, 20 or below % of students that have to take Dev Ed. That number has gone down quite a bit. And so we're seeing kids more prepared for college and not having to take Dev Ed, developmental ed, in the high school.
So we have about 2 minutes.
In higher ed, excuse me.
I've got one other question, then maybe we'll have time to squeeze in one from the audience. Nationally, there's been some talk, there have been some lawsuits that got a lot of attention. There's been some talk about making a high quality education a constitutional civil right for every student in the state. That strikes me as a great idea. I'm just curious if you have a view on it.
Say one more time, I had a thought.
So,
and I was
okay,
writing it
so
down.
the idea of amending the state constitution so that every child in Minnesota has a constitutional right to a high quality education. That strikes me as something that would be very, very powerful and very positive. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on it.
Well, I think you'd have to get the stakeholders to agree on what was a high quality education and how do you measure a high quality education. I think that would be the toughest part, would be trying to get agreement around that. Currently, we have a lawsuit in Minnesota around segregated schools and an equitable education and what's being delivered in Minnesota. So I think some of that might come out of that lawsuit. There's opportunity to be able to kind of redefine equitable opportunities for students through that process, potentially with the legislature and the courts figuring that out over the next year or so. So there may be opportunity. What my thought was, was earlier when we were talking about kind of designing schools and college readiness, and your probe about are kids ready. Kids, I think, are ready in a mature way more so than they have ever been in terms of use of technology, self-advocacy, that kind of stuff. Where I think we're falling down in education gets back to your question about how would I redesign schools. I forgot to say that I think we're doing a disservice to students by not focusing on writing. And I think that communicating and writing are absolutely critical, and we're completely missing the boat. When you get to higher education, our kids are having challenges and difficulties because they're not able to take the information that they can easily get and then restate it, argue, be persuasive, put it down on paper, and actually have coherent, connected thoughts around a certain topic or problem. And I think that's where our curriculum needs to change, in that we need to have a greater focus on consuming information, using information, and then being able to communicate the information through writing or through speaking.
Well, please join me in thanking Brenda for joining us today and giving us her comments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.